Okay, so I was gonna get ready and go finish up this brass turning tutorial that got us started on this, but I felt like I kind of left that hanging a little bit. The whole thing about getting you started on wind drift, I'm gonna have to get you started a little more. This is not the answer, but we talked in the last video about how the fact that it's not the wind blowing on the bullet that blows the bullet over. There is no argument here. It doesn't matter what some hosebag's opinion is on it. Nothing matters except physics, and the physics state quite simply that that's not how it works. So, I just didn't want to leave it at only a wind drift thing, because there's quite a few different forces acting on the bullet. The biggest one is the fact that it's flying through air, and it has a 3,000 foot per second bullet is going 2,000 miles an hour. And I'm going to use miles an hour some of the time because it's tempting to take feet per second to go, yeah, that's just kind of something I don't understand. I understand inches and I understand miles per hour because I drive around. I have 10 mile an hour wind. I can watch the wishes blowing across, or I can walk around to the wind flag, or I can do different things, and I can have a guess what. But 2,000 mile an hour wind, I have no idea. But what I said in the last video was, once you understand that for the bullet to make it to the target, it must balance on whatever it's pounding through. And if that pounding through is not straight ahead, but it also has a side wind, then it must turn to match that side wind. At which point, when it turns, its own base drag sucks it off course, so it drifts downwind. It gets dragged downwind. But I also teased you with a picture of the fact that when the wind pushes a bullet over, or when the wind acts on a bullet, it also produces some up and down. And I promised you that I was going to get your mind, I'll explain in time, especially if people start asking questions, exactly what it is. But there are three poorly understood characteristics of bullet flight. One of them is spin drift. I mean, stability is the big one, and BC, and that all has to do with it flying forward. Wind drift, or spin drift, or that odd propensity of bullets to group in a line, so that from my perspective, when I'm shooting at a target, the bullets on the left hit high, the bullets on my right, so I turn this around so you can see the line of the bullets being blown back and forth in the wind forms like this. There's only so much that can be acting on this bullet. It goes back to what I said about mechanism. So there is another force acting on the bullet, and that's called gravity. When the bullet leaves the gun, boom, it's flying through the air. Gravity is trying to suck it to the ground. Now, I've asked this question about, this is kind of one of my lead-in questions to ballisticians, because it all comes back to bullets being overstabilized, nosing over to follow their trajectory or not. And it takes a broad overview. I said earlier about specialists, mechanical specialists, engineers, mechanical engineers. Flight engineers, a lot of times well, let me just start over again. Flight engineers are very different than people who've been through flight school and understand flight mechanics. Because for the most part, they don't understand flight mechanics. They learned flight mechanics. They got through the tests. The same thing is true of, it's hard to find a ballistician that's not just a number plugger. It's hard to find an engineer that's not just a number plugger. I deal with engineers every day in my real job. And for the most part, they pull numbers out of a book and they throw things down on paper and they give us wall designs and beam and truss and moment arm designs and steel frame designs. And we just go build them. just the silly guys out on the field. Well, some of them are geek out enough just to want to know why, so that in the field, I'm on a job right now. In fact, that call I got a little bit was Cameron, inspector, calling to tell me that this job finally got signed off. It was either that or the gravel guy, but that's a couple. I just got signed off on a job that's been held up for a week. Two important calls that have come in during this time frame here, and it was only because of bad calls and non-understanding, and the fact that I designed a retaining wall not from an engineering but simply from a layman's perspective, using engineering diagrams and of all types, and then I had it validated by an engineer. So not all ballisticians are geeks. Not all people who study ballistics also study gyroscopes. Gyroscopes is a whole nother field. Go get a kid's gyroscope. Find out what happens when you bump a gyroscope. It's fascinating. You can do it with a bicycle wheel. Get a bicycle wheel spinning and yank on it, and you're going to find that 90 degrees ahead of rotation and 90 degrees, you go like this and it fights you. It produces an... This is how motorcycles actually work. You bang into a corner or you bang over to avoid a deer. You got to steer the wrong way. You've got to counter steer because of the gyroscopic effect produces some really weird and startling forces. By the same token, in a perfectly flying body, something called gyroscopic precession is fighting to maintain stability under a deceleration. I don't know if that makes sense. A power gyroscope will just, you can navigate across the ocean with it. By the same token, you got this gyroscope going through the air, and you start adding up the forces, and one of the first things I ask a ballistician when I meet him is, if you were to fire a bullet on the moon, because people ask ballisticians, what causes a bullet to nose over or not nose over? And this is where their brains just fall apart. Well, gravity. No, not well, gravity. So I ask people, okay, if I were to fire this bullet on the moon, would it still nose over? Would its trajectory still nose over, or would it stay pointed in the attitude that it took off? Because obviously the moon is a sphere. You fire a bullet from here, and it's going to do one of two things. It's going to stay pointed that same way until it falls to the ground. Boom, 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 falls to the ground. Or you fire that bullet on this is a real small moon. It's going to keep its nose pointed in the right way until it falls to the ground. So you get these people saying bullets get overstabilized and they fly nose high. Well, on the moon they would. But I'm sorry, here on Earth they don't. Because there's a mechanism that keeps them from doing that. And it's a mechanism that doesn't freaking exist on the moon. Gravity exists in both places. Now, oddly, gravity's cool because got a case, got a bullet, got a gun that's hanging here in what we're going to fictionally call horizontal. Later I'll get into, climbing side and falling side of trajectories and bullets rising, and this gets stupid. But here's the bottom line. You lay this bullet and gun close to horizontal, put a nice level on it. Boom! This bullet takes off, flying away. The main forces acting on it are the buffeting wind, 2,000 mile per hour wind on its nose, and the gravity. It's being sucked to the ground. Now, I did this experiment in, I think, 7th grade. I came in and bolted a blowgun into the vise, and I put a wire switch where you break the wire here and it kills the force to an electromagnet, which drops a magnet. And I hung a target on the wall way on the other end of the room by an electromagnet. And I sighted through the bore at the electromagnet, and when the bullet left, pew, the electromagnet dropped way on the other side of the room. I'll let you guys figure out what happens. But suffice it to say that on a horizontal scenario, that bullet traveling sideways has a gravitational component. It falls to the ground at a rate that's completely independent of its travel in this direction. I can't say completely, but 99.6% independent. And another experiment that we did when I had my blowgun deal set up was we also fired a blowgun dart, and when the contacts broke at the end, another dart dropped. So we had a dart going this direction in the gym and another dart dropping to the floor. And we had a sensor mat so that when they both touched down you could tell. And they were milliseconds apart. This dart, let's call it this bullet, flew over, fell to the ground in essentially the same time it took for this bullet or dart to fall to the ground. So this motion is not tied to this motion directly. Now, in the real world, once we have understood that it's base drag that steers a bullet when that other force of the wind acts on it, gravity's going to do what gravity's going to do. It's going to suck you to the ground. You fly through the air for 1 second, you're going to be falling at 30 miles an hour at the end of that second. You fall through the air for 2 seconds, you're going to be falling at 60 miles an hour. And I hope some of you hear what I'm saying and say, well, that's not right. There's no way it's exactly 30. And say, no, it's not 30 and it's not 60, but it's close enough. If one of you comes back and says, I'm not even going to tell you the actual numbers. Around 1 second is around 30 miles an hour that it's falling. Around 2 seconds, it's around 60 miles an hour. Falling. So, if a bullet's flying through the air for 1.5 seconds, it might get blown over by a 10-mile-an-hour crosswind, 20, 30 inches. It depends on the bullet. There's so many things. Could be 60 inches. A real fast light bullet could be blown over, feet, many feet. But the other things that are going on are the fact that, and this is why I asked that question of a ballistician. Okay, what does gravity, the bullet's going around the gravitational field of the Earth. It's going to do one of two things. It's either going to stay in its same or fight for nose high, or it's going to turn to follow. Which one is it? All the living ballisticians that I know swear that bullets fly nose high. And I can name them on the web and you can go find them. Also, there's not a single ballistician living that I know who can explain why bullets print at an angle in a crosswind. Nor that can truly tell you why spindrift occurs. I doubt that you're ever going to see spindrift, but if you shoot a lot from 600 yards and beyond, you're going to see that your bullets are dragged to the right more than they're dragged to the left. There's two reasons for that. And Coriolis actually is one. But the thing about Coriolis is that the stupid people have convinced us that we have to think about where we're pointing. Oh, obviously the Coriolis. See, when you hear the term, hey, I got another BS, I got another time to call BS. When somebody says obviously, BS! Because obviously, if you fire a bullet dead west versus dead east, and you're up here on the 48th parallel, obviously, Coriolis, obviously it's going to hit the ground quicker one way and slower the other. Obviously it's going to travel further up. No, none of these things are true. Coriolis, right hand. I'm facing you, so when I go right, it's your left. But the point is that from your perspective, Coriolis causes the bullet to go to the right. I don't care if you're pointed in the northern hemisphere. And I don't care if you're pointed north, south, east, or west. I don't care if you pointed some combination thereof. All you got to know is that it hews to the right. spin drift in a right-hand twist barrel also bears you to the right. But it's not poorly understood. It's not mysterious. It's simply wind. Simply wind. Once you understand, and here, people, is where I really want you to think. Bullet is flying through the air. No wind comes and pushes the nose. All of this, there's sail analogies. There's more bullet here for the wind to push against than there is there, and the moment arm is such that bullshit. Purely and simply, the bullet is pounding forward through a 2,000 mile per hour. It's balancing precariously on a 2,000 mile per hour wall. That wall shifts by 10 miles, 20, 30 miles an hour. The bullet has to rebalance on the new wall. And then that deceleration, that base drag, the bullet is slowing down. That energy has to go somewhere. If you understand that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, if you understand that it takes power to lift this, that it doesn't matter whether you winch it up with a rope, it doesn't matter if I scoop it with a pitchfork, it doesn't matter if I pick it with my fingers, it doesn't matter if I roll it up an inclined plane. I still have a mechanical displacement from here to here. That's work. So, you got a bullet, and it has a bunch of energy, and it's pounding into the wall, and it's losing velocity that has to be translated somewhere by energy. Heat can explain some of it, but it can't explain all of it. The answer is that it's base drag, and the energy is transferred to sucking the bullet off. That probably made some of you feeble-minded people giggle, and those that did, you might want to leave now because there's not going to be any car chases. And you're not going to be willing to understand this. So the bullet's flying through the air, the wind component hits from this side, and it doesn't blow the nose over. Instead, the nose reacts slightly into the wind. The base drag sucks it off course. Going like this, it sucks it off course. I'm only have time to go into one thing here, and that's this is why it's so frustrating to get into ballistics. It has to be done in small gulps, and it has to be done in ways that build, like building blocks, one on the other. So I'm going to take spin drift, and I'm going to explain to you why spin drift, or the commonly referred to right-hand drift, exists. I'm going to tell you the mechanism which nobody on this planet has ever told you before. There's not a ballistics text that you can read and understand. There's not a ballistician that you can ask this question of. In fact, when you watch this video and you go talk to a living ballistician, I will be curious to find out, because it's the first time this information has been put out into the public eye and say, hey, this is what causes right-hand spin drift. This specifically is what causes right-hand spin drift. And it is that there's another component that we haven't talked about yet called the yaw of repose. And for this, I'm going to point the bullet right at the camera. And you're going to picture that the wind is coming straight onto it. Because that bullet's always kind of fighting to get out of line, and fighting to get back into line, because every time it does that makes a force. It is actually stabilizing to have a gentle wind. A gentle wind makes a bullet fly better than it trying to fly through perfectly calm air. I brought this up in one of the last videos. If you could fly through compressed air with no gravity, you couldn't shoot very good. So here we have gravity compresses the air, the bullet's flying through the air. It needs a slight wind to give it something to fight against so that it can achieve what's called an angle of repose. Now, if you look at my diagram, which I threw in the garbage earlier, man, I'm getting close to time. Man, I'm getting close to time. Okay, remember this thing? Wind blows like this. Bullet is flying. its angle of repose is generated by the wind on its belly, which we haven't talked about yet. You add a little side wind to it and it changes its angle of repose such that the tail comes up a little and the bullet actually climbs. It actually flies uphill. You'll have to think about this. It doesn't fly uphill, but it's drifting this way and it's got a slight upward component. The wind from this side causes its nose to pop up and it sucks it downwind. So picture your bullet coming this way, going that way. These are the motions that you have, because remember, it's always the suck on the base of the bullet that causes this. The reason, the one single solitary reason that bullets drift to the right, I have to get behind drifts to the right, is because of wind. Yaw of repose and wind. And you ask yourself, what's the wind? What's the wind? Remember a couple of minutes ago how I said that a bullet is falling? If it fell for a second, it's falling at 30 miles an hour. That means it's got a 30 mile per hour wind on its belly. That doesn't exist on the moon. It's falling through the air at 30 miles an hour. That's a wind. That means that the bullet has to pitch to match that. So you've got side vectors, you've got the falling wind, you got the frontal wind. I want all of you to sit, sleep, think. When you're pooing, I want you thinking about this. The winds that are on the bullet, and they cause it to settle into its resting state, which is called a yaw of repose. And that yaw of repose is slightly off center, and whichever side of the center line of the trajectory the yaw of repose occurs, wherever the butt of that bullet is, that's the way the bullet's going to go, because it's being sucked off course. 2 seconds of travel. A normal bullet takes 1.5 to 1 3/4 seconds. By the time it hits the target at 1,000 yards, it's got a 30, 40, 50 mile an hour, 45 mile an hour wind on its belly. That causes this yaw of repose, and I'm out of time, so you're going to have to take this. This is why this is not me teaching you, it's you going away and thinking about this. Wind on the nose, wind on the side, wind on the belly. Falling 45 miles an hour. It's got a 45 mile an hour wind on its friggin' belly, people. That is why spindrift. The overriding reason why is physics.